The history of all hitherto society is the history of class struggle. Workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. Those words are immortalized in the revolutionary pamphlet of the German philosopher Karl Marx. Good afternoon, and welcome back to the brutal capitalist dictatorship of Great Britain. Today, I am in Highgate Cemetery, where the most famous and illustrious resident, Karl Marx, is buried. Today, I hope to give you a little introduction to the life and ideas of Karl Marx, why Karl Marx is such an influential person in the world, and 5 misconceptions many people, including people in Malaysia, get wrong about Karl Marx. Are you ready? Let's go. Both loved and hated in equal measure, Karl Marx is one of the most controversial modern philosophers. Some consider him to be a symbol of revolution, a symbol of rebellion against class society, a fighter for the underdog, a champion of the downtrodden, while others consider him to be the starting point of tyrannical authoritarian regimes. But whatever you may think of Mr. Marx, there is no doubt that his writings changed the world forever and shook the very foundations of society that we live in. Now, before I start today's video, I just have to make it very clear that I'm not a Marxist. I don't consider myself to be knowledgeable enough to call myself a Marxist, and I don't think being a Marxist is something you can just put on yourself like a necklace or a shirt. I think that to call yourself a Marxist is like to call yourself a Newtonian. You have to really understand and know the theory in depth. And besides, I'm not a communist. Communism is illegal in Malaysia. I'm a socialist, yes, but not exactly a communist. Look at me, I don't even have the discipline to struggle in the jungle for my beliefs, and I don't think I'm prepared to be exiled from one country to the next like Karl Marx was. But having said that, I hope to give Karl Marx a fair hearing, which I feel he has not been given in Malaysia, because much of what we know about Karl Marx comes from reactionary propaganda, in no small part spread by the colonizers. So I hope to give him a fair hearing. And another disclaimer I have to make is that this video is only an introduction to Karl Marx's life. I still recommend that you read Karl Marx's writings and you read literature about Mr. Marx. Lenin is actually a good place to start, because if you start with Lenin and then you move on to Marx, it becomes much easier to understand, because Lenin is far more digestible than Marx. But this is only a cursory introduction to Karl Marx's life. It's no substitute to reading, so please do as much of your own reading as possible, okay? So, without further ado, let us begin. So Karl Marx was born on May 1818 to a middle-class Jewish family in the town of Trier, Germany. Marx was not his family's original surname, it was a Jewish surname, but they changed it in order to avoid persecution by the authorities and by the German society of that time. Because, as you know, Jewish people were not looked upon fondly in most of modern European history and medieval European history. So Marx was a student of philosophy who followed the philosophy of Hegel, the German philosopher. And there are many who say that you have to start reading Hegel first before you move on to Marx. To be honest, I've never read Hegel before. But what I can tell you is that Marx's ideology is fundamentally the ideology known as dialectical materialism, which is fundamentally seeing history not as disparate parts, but rather as an interconnected web of one event leading to the next event. So, if anybody is a Marxist, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's my understanding of dialectical materialism. The past controls the present, and the present controls the future, so to speak. And throughout all epochs of human history, Marx theorized that the locomotive that moved history forward was this thing known as class struggle, or the struggle between the oppressor and the oppressed. Marx believed that everything up to this point, from the very beginning of human society, has been a battle between classes. Be that the battle between the feudal lords and the peasants, or the slave masters and the slaves, or the bourgeoisie, the capitalist and the proletariat. Each class fights one another, and this results in the overthrow of one class by the next. And Marx believed that this period of human history, the period known as capitalism, was the last stage of class antagonisms. Now, one of the biggest misconceptions that people have of Marx is that Marx invented socialism. That's not really true, because socialism, the concept of socialism at least, had existed for at least 50 years before Marx was born. But Marx fundamentally created this strain of socialism, which he called scientific socialism, as opposed to the previous branches of socialism. So, according to Marx, socialism, or the concept of collective ownership of the means of production, should be a scientific process, very much like gravity or Newtonianism. So previous socialists before Marx were labeled utopian socialists, because they believed in a world where everybody would share, the rich would share with the poor, and all would be better off. But Marx's strain of socialism is very different from previous generations of socialists, because Marx believed that human nature was such that people would constantly clash until class society was resolved, and there would be no more class society left. So he labeled this branch of socialism scientific socialism. And basically the gist of scientific socialism, or the gist of Marxism, is that the workers who produce value ought to have control over the means of production, meaning the factories, the companies, and so on and so forth. Because the Marxist view of the world is that society is based around exploitation, whether that be the exploitation of the Roman or the Chinese or the Arab slave masters against the slaves, or whether that be the exploitation of the feudal lord against the peasants, or whether that be the exploitation of the capitalist against the proletariat. These would eventually result in a seismic change known as a class struggle, because classes are fundamentally antagonistic to each other, because classes exist not in tandem, but rather with mutually opposing interests. So, according to Marx, we have reached the final stage of human society before the stage known as communism, which is basically a society without classes. Now, there are 5 misconceptions that people have about Karl Marx that I would like to address today. Now, the first misconception that people have about Mr. Marx is that Mr. Marx hated capitalism. Mr. Marx was anti-capitalism. While it is true that he was against the exploitative nature of class society, Mr. Marx didn't view capitalism as uniquely evil compared to feudalism or slave society. There's no serious Marxist in the world who believes that capitalism was not an improvement over the previous material conditions, like slave society or feudal society, in which people lived in far worse conditions. Marx even ironically praises the bourgeoisie in the Communist Manifesto as having simplified class antagonisms and broken down society into two hostile camps, thereby making the socialist job easier. As Marx tells us in the Communist Manifesto,
the bourgeoisie historically has played a most revolutionary part. The bourgeoisie, whenever it has got their upper hand, has put an end to old feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. It has pitilessly torn asunder the mortally feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors, and has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment. It has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism in this icy water of egotistical calculation. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value, and in place of this numberless, indefeasible chartered freedoms, has set up the single unconscionable freedom, free trade, in one word, for exploitation, veiled by religious and political illusions. It has substituted naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. The bourgeoisie, by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production, by the immensely facilitated means of communication, draws all, even the most barbarian nations, into civilization. The cheap prices of commodities are the heavy artillery with which it batters down all the Chinese walls, with which it forces the barbarians' intensely obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate. It compels all nations, on pain of extinction, to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization in their midst, i.e., to become bourgeois themselves. In one word, it creates a world after its own image.
it is capitalism that makes socialism or the transition to a classless society possible, because the peasant has now become proletarianized. The peasant has now become a worker and is now going to develop a thing known as class consciousness. So no, the first misconception that we have to address is that Marx did not hate capitalism, but rather Marx saw it as the decaying system, the last remnant of class society that was created by the bourgeoisie or the capitalist class that would eventually birth the system known as socialism, which is the transition of the power from the ruling class to the working class. Now, the second misconception that people have about Karl Marx, including people in Malaysia, was that Karl Marx wanted total and absolute social equality. And you would be forgiven for falling into that trap in believing that Mr. Marx wanted a totally, completely equal society when you look at Maoist Red Guards wearing exactly the same uniform, eating exactly the same food, and doing exactly the same thing. But Marx himself tells us that equal pay for everyone and absolute equality was in fact a bourgeois notion. That the idea is not that everyone should be paid the same regardless of what they do, but rather that the workers should receive what is due to them based on what they perform. That is the essence of Marxism. And another misconception that we really have to address is that Karl Marx was anti-religion. Yes, it's very easy to see how people can fall into this idea when Karl Marx said, religion is the soul of a soulless world, the heart of heartless conditions, and the opium of the masses. So people hear that quote and they automatically think, well, this guy must hate religion. But that's not quite how he saw it. Rather, Marx is filled with a deep-seated sense of compassion for people who have fallen into religion, or rather for people who cope with religion, who use religion as a way to cope in believing that their material conditions will be improved in the next world. But as a matter of fact, Marx didn't hate religion, but rather he saw it as a symptom of a broken society in which people were turning to the next world, or they were looking at the next world as a form of hope to improve their miserable material conditions. So Marx argues, why do we have to wait till the next world? Why can't we improve our conditions in this material world itself? That should be the idea, that should be the point. So when he describes it as opium, he's not saying it with contempt, but rather with compassion for people who've fallen on hard times and who need something to give them hope. But most socialist countries throughout the world have been respectful towards religion. Stalin, for example, was very, very respectful to the Orthodox Russian Church, and in fact, Orthodox Russian churches would even portray him as something of a patron saint. And most socialist societies that follow the doctrine of Marxism do not treat religion as if it is mutually exclusive with being a good Marxist. There have been many religious people who were great Marxists, like Abdullah Sidi or Rashid Maidin, for example. Abdullah Sidi from the Communist Party of Malaysia. Now, he was a very, very devout Muslim, but also a very, very devout Marxist. So clearly those two things are not mutually exclusive. Now, the fourth misconception that I want to bring up is that Marx's writings are cold and mechanical. You know, it's easy to think that Marx's writings are very cold and mechanical, and that because Marx was not an idealist, but rather a dialectical materialist, there are some who think that Marx was creating a very cold, robotic ideology. And many liberals do not like Marx because they think a Marxist society would be a very cold and callous sort of society. And the thing is that while Marx was certainly no idealist, it doesn't mean that Marx didn't have empathy or Marx didn't have morals. If you read the essay that he wrote in 1844, known as Estranged Labour, you can see that Marx cuts deep into the heart of alienation with very, very emotive language, and he expresses his heartfelt thoughts on how he feels the workers are being estranged from their nature and estranged from the value that they produce and estranged from the goods they produce. So, read Marx's writings beyond Kapital, and you will see a man who is not only a cold, heartless machine, but rather a man with good points and bad points, but nevertheless a human man. Read his letters to Jenny, his wife. Now, the fifth and final misconception that I have about Marx, and this is going to piss off some Marxists, is that Marx was some kind of a prophet. There are people on the internet, especially on places like Twitter, who hang on to every single word that Marx says, who treat every single one of his words as gospel truth that cannot be questioned. Whenever you argue with them, they'll always say, did Marx say this? Did Marx say that? Now, the fact is that Marx was a man of his time. Marx was a human. He wasn't God. and he never claimed to be God. And he laughed at the prospect of there being an ideology created in his name. And he even said, I myself am not a Marxist. But the thing is, Marx is not a person, or Marx rather is not a figure that should be seen as a prophet-like figure who can do no wrong. No doubt he had his own biases, he had his own flaws. For example, there were times, if you'll pardon me for saying that Marx could be quite Eurocentric. And Marx made some prediction errors in thinking that the developed capitalist societies like or Germany would get socialism first. Now we see that Marx was way off the mark in that respect. In fact, Marx didn't have much hope for Russia. Marx actually thought Russia was a lost cause, at least for now. But you can see that even though Marx thought that Russia was a lost cause, when Lenin applied Marx's theories in Russia, he took a peasant society that was almost completely illiterate and he turned it into one of the most educated and literate societies in the world. And in fact, it was one of the first societies that sent a man to the moon. And this was by taking Marxist theories and by applying it to the material conditions of his own country. Now, there were many Marxists at the time who considered Lenin to be a heretic, because Lenin thought that you could jump from feudalism straight to socialism. And many considered the peasant class to be a reactionary class who would always side with the ruling class, because the peasant class had not yet become proletarianized. So many people in Russia believed that Lenin, or rather many Marxists, many orthodox Marxists thought that Lenin was a heretic. But the fact of the matter is that Lenin not only took Marxist theories, adapted them for the material conditions of Russia, and got the peasants on his side. He got the peasants on his side, and he transformed Russia into a literate and basically more equal society than it ever had been during the time of the Tsars. And not only did Lenin successfully adapt Marx's theories, he basically brought Marx out of obscurity and back into the mainstream. Because until Lenin, Marx's writings were almost becoming non-existent, or they were falling out of fashion. Marx was not a popular man when he was alive, and he almost went into obscurity had it not been for Lenin, who revived his writings. So what we can learn from this is that socialism or Marxism is not something that you treat as some kind of a religion that you hang on to every single word of Marx. No, you have to adapt his theories to the material conditions of your own society. So if you were to apply Marxism in Malaysia, it would be very different from applying it to a country like China or Russia. Every country has its own peculiarities, and every country must follow the peculiarities of its own civilizational uniqueness. That's not to say that we should be hanging up a portrait of Marx in our office and treating every one of his words as gospel truth. Marx had his flaws like any other man. But that doesn't mean we throw the baby out with the bathwater and not apply any of his theories. Because his theories have proven to be true in many regards. For example, the class theory or the class struggle theory is a very difficult theory to argue against when you see class struggle playing out in real time. And it's very difficult to argue against the fact that China has lifted millions of people out of poverty, and China is enjoying the best period in all of its history And the fact is that until Lenin came around, Russia was a poor, illiterate, backwater peasant society that was transformed into a literate and educated society with a civilized standard of living. So it's not that we will worship Marx as some kind of a hero figure or some kind of a prophet, but we can apply his theories. And it would be a damn shame if Malaysians were all barred from reading Karl Marx, because that's like barring someone just because, our ruling class doesn't like Karl Marx. Well, not surprised why, because Malaysia is a semi-feudal, semi-capitalist society. But to not read Karl Marx just because you don't like him is similar to not reading Newton just because you think Newton was a racist, which he probably was. Einstein was a racist as well. Einstein didn't like Chinese people, but does that mean we throw out all of Einstein's theories just because we don't like some of Einstein's social views? To sum up Marx's ideology in a nutshell, the idea is not that everybody must be the same, but rather that the people who produce value, the workers who produce value, must be given their due. From Marx's point of view, 9 out of 10 of society works and receives very little, and 1 out of 10 of society does no work and receives everything. The 9 out of 10 being the proletariat, the working class, who don't own any means of production, who are forced to sell their labor power to a capitalist in order to keep a roof over their head and put food in their belly. So their labor is really coerced. And the group that does not work but receives all the rewards, that reaps all the reward, would be the bourgeoisie, the capitalist. Because the capitalist, like in a sense a new feudal lord, is basically the group that collects the profits or surplus value, which should ideally be due to the person who produces that value. Let me give you an example of how surplus value works. Take a jacket. God, why am I using my own jacket? A jacket that costs about, maybe my jacket costs about 200 ringgit. Now, to produce this jacket would cost no more than maybe 30 ringgit. And when you factor in all the rent and the electricity and water, that might factor into about 50 ringgit. So when you take the worker's wages and you add to that 50 ringgit, the worker makes about maybe 2 ringgit from the jacket, or maybe 5 ringgit, let's be generous. So the surplus value is basically whatever the capitalist who owns the factory, the means of production, collects, that goes into the capitalist's pocket, that the worker does not receive. It's kind of like the rent that you pay, in the sense, for working in a company. You work, you have the honor of working for a capitalist, you have the privilege of working for someone, but in the end, you have to pay rent to him in the form of profits in order to keep your place in his company. So the capitalist reaps the reward, but it is the worker who produces the good with his or her hands. So without the worker, the capitalist may as well close shop. And that is why Marx describes labor as the father of wealth and nature as its mother. Because without labor and without nature, you cannot have wealth. Labor has produced beautiful things, palaces for the rich and hovels for the poor. While the capitalist grows richer and fatter off the sweat, blood and tears of the worker only continues to reproduce his basic existence through the meager wages that he receives. This is fundamentally exploitation, or rather the profit motive, which Marx wanted to do away with. And in order to do away with the profit motive, you would have to do away with class society. Because when everybody is a worker, you cannot exploit anyone when everyone is a worker. And that is fundamentally the ideal of a Marxist society. A society in which there are no social hierarchies, while everyone receives their pay according to how much they produce. Everybody is politically equal, and there are no social hierarchies that distinguish people from each other. And no man or woman has got unchecked power over another man or woman, that no husband has unchecked power over his wife, no king has unchecked power over a subject, because there'll be no more kings in Marx's ideal world. And fundamentally, exploitation will be a thing of the past, and we can work together towards a harmonious and prosperous society. Now, has Marx's dream been realized? Or I shouldn't use Marx's dream because he wasn't an idealist, but has the society of communism been realized? Has a classless, moneyless, stateless society where all the workers are comrades regardless of which country they come from been realized? No, of course not. And Marx didn't think that such a society would be realized in his lifetime. Marx did not expect to see socialism in his lifetime. Marx did not expect to see communism in his lifetime. But I think that greed and materialism are short-term objectives. They cannot be the basis of a stable society. Look at a country like America, for example. It is a miserable capitalist dystopia where the strong eat the weak. Eventually, humanity is going to have to come and realize one day that, greed and materialism cannot, in fact, sustain a stable society, and humanity is going to have to question its motivations eventually. Now, whether the world will become Marxist or not, that's a moot point. That is really up to debate. As for whether Marx's ideal has been realized, no, it certainly hasn't, because there are no classless, stateless, moneyless societies in this world. But, who knows what the next 100 years may show? Marx basically shows the workers the shape of the world so they can tear it down with their own hands and build a new one. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to treat every single one of his words as gospel truth, but he certainly provides a very, very interesting worldview and an interesting analysis of this world. And he can serve not as a guru, not as some kind of a prophet, but as a guide as to how we can better utilize the forces of production. So, I'm going to end it here, and I do encourage you to read as much of his work as possible and make up your own mind. This is not a propaganda video, okay? In the end, I want everyone to make up their own mind and to form their own analysis. So, I'm going to ask you to subscribe to my channel, hit the subscribe button, and I'm going to say goodbye to Mr. Marx now. Yeah, if you loved it, write a comment down in the comment section. If you hated it, also write a comment. And thank you very much. And may the workers of the world find happiness and satisfaction in the job they do. And may they be justly rewarded for their efforts. Have a great day.